I am recording now. Great. So thank you. We want to welcome to our group Kathy Evans, who, as you know, is a professor at Eastern Mennonite University and a well-known person in the field of restorative justice, RJE, restorative justice in education. And as Kimiko mentioned, co-author of the paper that we've been studying a lot. She's also co-author of the little book of restorative justice in education, if you haven't had a chance to see that. So Kathy, we've had a chance to have some conversation, and most of us know kind of the basics of RJE now. And one of the things that we think from your perspective, you can tell us about the most effective implementations of RJE that you've seen, and maybe a little something about how they started and how they got there. So we thought we'd start there, and then we're going to take a round of questions from people and go from there with questions and answers. So yeah, and if there's some things that you want to tell us specifically as we're looking to our process of adopting restorative justice in education, that would be great.
The first thing I want to say is thank you. So just hearing like what's one thing, listening to, like, I kind of feel like I should just say, go do it. You're on it, go for it. You're on the right path. You don't really need me. Yeah. And so like, I want to name that I have a particular lens, and most of what I know as far as concrete, what this looks like, I've learned from other educators. So I see myself as just a conduit of professional learning communities in lots of different places. So like Harrisonburg City Schools is doing some really beautiful things. And so I have the privilege of being able to teach Harrisonburg City School teachers and principals and school counselors, and they share things that are working and things that aren't. And then I get to write those up and say, so according to Harrisonburg, like this is really working. And so most of everything that I would share with you today, I would share that I've learned those from practitioners, from educators who are doing really good work. And so I want to say thank you for doing really good work. I've been kind of following along with what's happening in APS, and I can see that you're doing the slow, steady work. You're doing the very intentional work. You're laying those strong foundations. And that's always one of the things that I suggest is find your team that are on board. Find the people like, this is my thing. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to become more restorative, not just with my students, but with my colleagues and with my family. And I'm going to work to embody these values and these principles. Find that group of people and do the good, hard work, go deep. It's like, I'm from Mississippi, and I grew up with loblolly pines. And I love loblolly pines so much. And my favorite memories growing up are walking through the woods of my grandparents' farm and listening to those pine trees whistle in the wind. But the roots of those pine trees go about yo deep, right? And so when we have bad storms that come through, those trees fall over fast because they don't have the deep roots. There is an oak tree back on the back end of my grandparents' farm that's been there probably 300 years. I don't know. I have no way of knowing that number, but I know that it is huge and it is solid. And I know that if we were to look, its roots would go way deep. And so it's able to withstand stuff. And I think nature teaches us that the deeper we go, the more we're sustainable in the work that we're doing. And so I think I see you doing that work, and I'm really grateful for that. I also just really, really want to affirm the student-led work. This is a new thing for me. And I humbly offer that. Like, I wasn't on board with student leadership at the beginning. I thought we had to start with the educators because they were the ones that set the climate, and I was wrong. Early on, I was wrong, and I realize now that sometimes students can do that leadership work in ways that the teachers, the principals cannot. And so I really strongly affirm student-led work, especially when we start talking about working not just within the school setting, but also where the school meets the community and where the school meets families. Like when students take ownership of that and it's theirs and they are given space to lead, they're able to transmit the powerful stuff in ways that sometimes educators just can't. And so I deeply affirm student leadership. And I also heard you mention readiness. I think that speaks to that again, those roots and that depth, the oak tree kind of mentality, that we find out who's already bent that way, who's already, like, even if you've never heard of restorative justice in education, those values and those principles are kind of older than us, way older than us, right? These ideas come from indigenous people, people who way predate us. It's why we do land acknowledgements, because we acknowledge that, like, there were people before colonizers got here. There were people who've lived with these values and beliefs for longer than I've been alive, longer than we've been a country. And so we should acknowledge that those values and beliefs are in us. They're part of our historic DNA. And so finding people who already have internalized those or acknowledged those values and beliefs, even if they don't know all of the right, I mean, not right, but the language of RJE, but they hold those values and principles. So who's doing that? Again, I mentioned Harrisonburg City Schools, and I'm always going to point to them. And one of the things that I've noticed that they do well is that they combine their restorative justice initiatives with things that are already in place. Because educators are often like remiss to like do one more thing. And so if we present restorative justice as yet another initiative, it can be pretty tiresome, like, oh, okay, this is the new thing, right? But if we're already doing social emotional learning, for example, which Harrisonburg City Schools were, that was kind of their umbrella. And then we're like, oh, okay, so restorative justice supports this thing that we're already doing. And so when we pull it in, it's not another thing, it's still part of the same thing. And so I think that's one of the things they've done. The other thing that I think Harrisonburg City Schools has done so beautifully is they have worked hard to include, and again, I heard you, they've worked really hard to include families. Harrisonburg City Schools has homeschool liaisons at the district level and at most of the schools. So at the high school, they have liaisons particularly for Spanish-speaking families, for Zulu-speaking families, for, I think there's 5 different liaisons that speak different languages so that they're able to collaborate with families in first languages. And so I think that's been really helpful, is onboarding that collaboration. Another school district that I'm thinking about that had a has had a pretty successful, and it was student initiated, a group of students, Somali women who had been at the middle school where they had done circle processes. They came to the high school, and because of the middle school feeder and the other middle school feeder, we ended up with 2 really different populations of students who clashed hard. And so at the high school, there were a lot of fights and conflicts. And so this one group of Somali girls who had come from this particular middle school said, we need circles. That's what we need. And so they started doing circles with this one group of girls, and then other people found out. And so my friend Anne ended up, I think she was doing 12 circles a week with different groups of girls across campus. And but the initiative that they did was in collaboration with a whole bunch of other initiatives that the school picked up to do justice, right? To build relationships and nurture those healthy relationships. And then to figure out what do we do with conflict and how do we transform that conflict and repair harm. And so picking up those initiatives collectively as a holistic, whole school kind of model. So I'll be quiet there, but those are some things that stand out to me. Goodness, I talked a long time. I apologize.
That wasn't long at all. I think we're all just like hanging on for everything that that you said. A lot of exciting examples. So what I'll do now, since we're at a pausing point, is we'll go ahead and do a round of questions that people have for you. And what we found is most effective is if we do the round of questions and then you start to address the things that come up in the questions, because sometimes people have questions that tag on to others and their themes and so forth. And that way everybody at least gets their question stated. So I'm going to go ahead and pass from my spot in the circle. I'm going to try to keep track of the questions. I don't know if you want to try to do that as well. So I'm passing before I pass, I'll just also note for the group that if somebody's already asked your question or you don't have a question, you always have the option to pass. And with that, I'm going to pass to Siobhan with appreciation.
Thank you, Leah. I almost don't want to ask this question. You spoke so highly of the Harrisonburg School District, but I would like to know, what kind of things did not work, and how were you able to redirect those to have them help the process as opposed to continue to kind of struggle with them. And with optimism, I pass to Lydia.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to pass right now. I don't have any specific questions.
Is this me? Okay. Hi. Okay, I guess I'm up, right? Okay. Kathy, thank you for your comments. A question, probably have a few that we'll have a chance to get to, but in reading some of the background materials, you noted that you raised, one of the points that was raised was that partial implementation can sometimes be worse than no implementation at all. And I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about how either the Harrisonburg City Schools or other systems have been able to implement effectively, given that it's a big new concept for a lot of people, and oftentimes across many different schools. And if you could give some of your observations as to what that looked like and how they were able to implement it effectively. Thanks. And I pass with hope to Marcia.
Hi. I think I'm wondering about students, because I know how powerful that can be once they're engaged. And what are some steps that you have seen that are effective in engaging students, particularly across different populations, the various racial groups, their special education, the mainstream? How do we bring those groups together effectively and have them become leaders in the process? I'm sorry, I forgot to pass. And with open-mindedness, I pass to Kimiko.
Thank you, Marcia. Thanks again so much for being here tonight, Kathy. And I was really glad to hear everything you shared. My question relates specifically to our special education students and our English as a foreign language students, or English as a second language students, I should say. Because, you know, we have a fairly significant population of ESL students here in APS, and many, many different languages spoken among them. And our special education population is like 10 to 12% of our students here in APS. And I'm just wondering about best practices for making sure that the needs of those students are met and that they're held and cared for within the development of these circles, and they don't end up just sort of being seen as like other or alternative. You know, I want them to be included at the very beginning, and sort of what strategies can you offer, or what have you seen work in relation to that? And with humor, I will pass back to Kathy, or actually Kathy, if it's all right, maybe we could skip you and I could pass to Yasmina.
Yes.
All right, so I will pass to Yasmina then. Thank you.
So Marcia and Kimiko pretty much covered my questions. So with curiosity, I pass to Zakia.
I don't have any questions with this time, but thank you for being here, Kathy. And I'm passing to, Sabrina's not here. Am I passing back to Alita? I think Alita went already.
Yes, Alita. Hi, Kathy. It's funny because I feel some kinship because you talked about Mississippi, and my mom is from Mississippi. And I know when you speak of that oak tree, because my grandfather had an oak tree, and we kind of think of the deep roots of all of our family members because he was a sharecropper who worked very hard, who couldn't read, and worked very hard. So when I hear rural, we lived outside of Laurel, Maryland, an urban town. So when I hear you say that, I kind of consider myself a Southern girl with a little city swagger. So I laugh when you talked about that oak tree because I have a picture of it as a reminder of the deep root and connection of my grandfather. So I appreciate that story.
Thank you.
Again, you talked a lot about that deep self-reflection and the need for that. Now, I know sometimes we speak of circles and then we're talking about conferences because there's a lot of different pieces or different processes involving restorative justice. So I think I hear a lot about the circles, and I did participate in a training around the whole restorative conferences because I'm thinking of the student population who have been suspended and they're returning back. So is that a process that's most schools get engaged in? Because that's a very involved process that requires trained restorative facilitators and versus circles in classrooms. So just want to hear a little bit about the conference piece and your experience and how you see that being implemented in stages within the RJ.
Thank you.
All right, and I think Alita, you're passing to me.
Yes, I pass to Leanne.
Thanks, Alita. And I actually have a question as well, and I'll turn it back to you, Kathy. And my question is actually a clarification around the notion of partial implementation. Alex brought that up, and I wasn't sure if he was meaning partial implementation as only part of a school system implements. So I want to actually clarify with you, when in Starts and Stumbles, we see this warning about partial implementation. Is that on a school basis that you're talking about partial implementation? And I'm going to couch that in the larger question because I know that for most of, probably all of us, our goal, overall long-term goal, is that all of APS embrace, whole school restorative justice and education. And how we get there is not likely to be by some top-down mandate, not very restorative. And also I think that was one of the misapplications. And you know, so we're looking toward how we would do that, and yeah, it won't happen all at once. So I think there's a question in there. Anyway, so I'm going to pass that back to you.
Mm. Yeah, I'm really grateful for that question, because I think for me, when I think about partial, I think what I mean is that it doesn't make sense, or I've seen negative things happen when we try to change our discipline systems without changing our culture. And so what happens, and I've seen this in Harrisonburg even, right? And so one of the questions was, what's not worked in Harrisonburg? And I'll come back to that in a second. But here's one of the things that we learned, or that we're learning, is that if we only change our discipline system, so then Mrs. Smith is in this classroom and she has a conflict with a student. And so she sends the student to the office, and the principal, who's been through the restorative justice program and is all about RJ, responds to the student in a very restorative way, but then leaves out the teacher in the process, right? And the student comes back to class having been quote unquote dealt with by an administrator, but the teacher wasn't part of that process and feels like, really? You just let him come back to class, or you let her come back to class? And so without there being some kind of whole school acknowledgement that this is the direction that we're going and working at the school climate, I fear that we will end up pushing people in corners where Mrs. Smith's now not a fan of RJ, right? She doesn't understand it. She doesn't get it. And now she has this same student who hasn't worked with her for any kind of accountability or support. And so, yeah, I think that's a dance that we have to do. What I don't want to imply is that if you can't do it whole scale, don't do it, because that's unrealistic, right? Some people are gonna, I'm a big fan of, well, so I'm a nerd. My PhD was in educational psychology. And so I'm like all into like learning theory. And so anyway, Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development. And like, I didn't just read that for my ed classes. Like I totally internalized the ZPD piece. And I really believe that. Like, I think that with any kind of learning, that we're all in our own ZPD. And if we're going to do good education around RJE, I was in a session earlier today on anti-racism at EMU. If we're going to do good anti-racism work, if we're going to do good math teaching, whatever we're doing, like if we're going to expect people to learn stuff, we have to meet them in their ZPD. We have to meet them at the place where they can actually learn it. Where they can actually show up for it. And so if I've got somebody in my class who is, or in my school who is super committed to punishment, like I have to meet them there, and we have to have a whole lot of conversations. Alita, you talking about the school to prison pipeline and the disproportionality in school discipline, and really wanting RJ to address that. I do too. It's what brought me to RJ. That was the conversation that initially brought me to restorative justice. But if I've got someone who's hell-bent on punitive models, then I need to meet them there, and we have to go through that series of learnings before we can get to what do we do instead, because they're not ready to ask the what do we do instead question. And so it might mean backing way up for some people and actually talking about an ethic of care, talking about why did you become a teacher in the first place? But I think that's where relationships happen for y'all in APS, as you are working with other educators, you're the ones who know those teachers. You're the ones who have the relationships with the principals, and it'll be on you to sit down and have coffee or Zoom coffee, and actually help them unpack some of their resistance and some of their questions. And so, no, I think we have to meet people where they're at. My girlfriend, who's an English teacher, would scold me right there for saying at the end of my sentence. But we have to meet people where they're at, and then walk with them to the next step. And that's I don't think we can do good RJ rollout any other way. It has to be relational, and we have to stick with the same principles that we want to promote, right? So I don't know if that completely answers the question, but the partial and whole school. Are there follow-up questions to that?
I'm good. I don't know about Alex.
Yeah, I do. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. A quick follow-up would be: Have you seen groups that are looking to introduce RJ into systems use aspects of a readiness survey to determine where you have reservoirs of support versus pockets of resistance, so to speak? And what did that look like, please?
So I'm going to refer you there to my friend Martha Brown. She just moved from Florida to Minnesota. Her doctorate degree is in assessment and evaluation. And then she got in with the RJ crowd and was like, oh, wait, who's evaluating RJ? Who's like assessing our systems to make sure they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing? And so she's worked a lot with readiness stuff. And she's kind of my go-to on having conversations about readiness. Marg Thorsborn out of Australia also talks a lot about readiness. And there's a group out of Vermont that do a lot of work with readiness evaluations as well.
Okay, thank you.
And I can get you those resources and those books. The Marg Thorsborn book I have right here. This is Getting More Out of Restorative Practices in Schools. And their chapter 1 is all about developing readiness work, and there's a lot of good resources in there. And then I can get you Martha Brown's contact information as well if you want that. I think readiness is super important, because if you have a whole bunch of people in a school who are very committed to punitive measures, you're not going to go far by saying, oh, let's sit in a circle and like have a conference. They're going to go, no, I want some accountability. And they don't understand yet that sitting in a circle and actually being accountable to their community is more powerful than just being held accountable for what they've done. That's a whole different model there. And so until they understand those kind of aspects, it's really hard to jump in and like reframe our whole discipline system.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that was one of the things, like in the whole what didn't work in Harrisonburg and what we're still tweaking. That was one of the things is they didn't necessarily do any kind of readiness work. And so it was a matter of first come, first serve kind of thing. And so who wants to be trained in RJE, and whoever signed up kind of went through. And there was a waiting list the first few years of people to go through the graduate certificate that we offer. And it was hit or miss. And so like the first cohort of educators who came through were from 4 different schools, and there were 5 different schools, and there were no administrators there. And so you had some educators like, oh, I'm all on board, but they weren't getting any kind of administrative support for what they were doing. And so they kind of got frustrated. And then the next cohort, we learned, oh, we need administrators in here. And so we had a cohort of almost all administrators, which was really great. But then they got all excited and we're like, oh, let's do it. And then it became kind of this top-down thing. And we had teachers. And so we've kind of been learning these things. We're starting our 6th cohort with Harrisonburg City Schools this year. And we've learned so much along the way, mostly because it wasn't working. And the story about the teacher who got frustrated because the administrators handled it through a restorative justice but didn't include her, like, that was real. That happened. And I wish that I could say it happened 5 years ago, but it didn't. It happened last year, which tells me, like, we still need to follow up with those administrators and say, it's not a conference if you haven't included the educator, the teacher, where the event happened. If that teacher feels like something's been done to her and not with her, then we're not fully applying the idea of shared ownership, shared leadership, shared accountability, shared decision-making, which is such core principle for RJ. And so we're still like following up and tweaking those things. Does that make sense? Follow-up questions there?
Absolutely. Would you indulge me for one more, or
Sure.
I know there were other questions that were asked. So
Sure.
I guess twofold. One, if a teacher is invested in the punitive system, oftentimes it's because they're trying to maintain a certain environment in their classroom of control. And I'm wondering if it's the incentive structure, if there are things that can be done at the level of helping teachers feel more comfortable that they can achieve the learning goals while also embracing RJ, as opposed to simply pushing someone away or out of that environment, out of community, in the interest of achieving the learning goal. And if that, and the follow-up part would be, does that start with the principal? Does it start even higher up so that the teacher isn't worried about not being rewarded for helping children learn? Because the essence is, hey, I'm trying to educate the kids, and I have someone who is undermining my efforts to do that. Any thoughts on that?
Several years ago, I wrote a piece on school discipline, and I talked about RJ, but it was before we had really kind of developed an RJE framework. But I used this concept of trickle-down bullying in there to talk about how we have the federal government who has no jurisdiction over public education, but they use money to coerce states to do what they want them to do. And then the states do the same thing with school districts, and the school districts do the same thing to administrators. The administrators do the same thing to teachers, and teachers do the same thing to students. And we have this culture of manipulating people to do what we want them to do, either through punitive measures or through coercive measures, sticks or carrots, right? And somewhere that has to stop along that cycle. If it can stop at the superintendent level, beautiful, beautiful. That's just amazing. But it has to stop at the principal level. And I have this image of a principal standing like this, and all of that weight of the federal government, the state government, all of the weight of those folks coming down on the principal, and the principal saying, not here. Here, I'm going to protect my teachers. Here, I'm going to take care of my staff. Here, the students in this class are not going to experience that toxicity. I'm gonna run this school with an ethic of care and shared leadership, and for me, as long as that can happen, you have a really good shot at shifting the culture of that school, despite what's going on in the district. If you can get your district leadership on board, which Harrisonburg has, and I'm so grateful. I think it's one of the things that has meant so much for Harrisonburg is that the former superintendent was a social worker by training, and so was all about social, emotional, and holistic teaching. And so they started an SEL component, and RJ fit right in with that. And their director of student services went through our program and was trained herself. Then the first cohort said, I need to know what's going on. And so she jumped in, and once she became really deeply aware of what was going on, then she then became the gatekeeper to all kinds. So our special ed and our school counselors and our behavior specialists and all of these divisions are now occupied by people who are bent restoratively, social, emotionally, trauma informed, et cetera. And so it's really been helpful at the district level. But I think even if it can't happen at the district level, that principle, and if it can't happen at the principal, I still won't walk away from it, because I still think a teacher can do that. To the extent that I have the ability to do so, these are my babies. And these 26 kids, I'm not sending them to the office because I know what's going to happen if they go to the office. So I'm going to hang on to them right here, and we're going to handle things here. And I know that that's not perfect, and that's hard work. And the higher we can get, that umbrella is better. But I've seen teachers do that really well, where nope, we're not going to be punitive in this room. We're not going to make fun of each other in this room. We're going to love one another here. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. That was fun to kind of think about and to get excited about right there. Yeah. I'd come real briefly to the student leadership and how do we do student leadership. The theme for our Restorative Justice and Education Conference this past year was student leadership. Sherry was at that conference and took a ton of notes, I know, and she has access to all of the materials. Anita Vadva out of Houston would be the go-to person here for me. Anita, I love Anita Vadva so much. She has her doctorate from Harvard, and she wanted to be a restorative justice coordinator. And instead of going into academia, she wanted to be in a school, and there wasn't a restorative justice position in Houston, which is where she wanted to settle down with her family. And so she took a job as an in-school suspension coordinator and started with the kids who were in school suspension and started pouring leadership skills into them while they were in ISS. And that's where she began. The next year, they let her teach a leadership class, and now the school that she works with has a full student-led RJE program. And last year, she went part-time, and so she just sits back and eats bonbons while the students do all the work. And then they started an organization called Restorative Empowerment for Youth, REY. And if you look them up on Facebook, you can see the kind of work that they're doing, but they're training other young people all over the country. They're speaking about youth-led leadership in all kinds. They're amazing. They are like, I just want to uphold their work and say they're doing that. And we should learn everything we can from Restorative Empowerment for Youth. Yeah. That's all I want to say about that, unless you have questions about that. Oh, good. Thanks, Kimco. That's beautiful. It's in the chat, the link. They're an amazing organization. So the students who graduate from Yes Prep Academy in Houston have the opportunity to go on and keep working for Ray and doing the work through Restorative Empowerment for Youth after they graduate. Anyway, yeah, so much respect for them. I'm gonna save special ed for last. And let's talk just a little bit about circles, conferences, reentry circles, all of that. Kimiko, if you would look up the RJoy, I don't know, maybe y'all have already looked at the reentry circle, the video from RJoy, Restorative Justice Oakland Youth. Do you?
I think.
Yeah,
I think
the reentry
have that.
circle.
I'll find that.
So I love that video. I think it shows how a circle process is used for someone coming back to school after a suspension or an expulsion. I think one of the things that I want to clarify is that fully implementing restorative justice doesn't mean that students won't ever be suspended. I would love that. And in a perfect world, we'll get there, but we're not there yet. And sometimes kids need a break. Sometimes there needs to be a moment where you go, need you to take a few days and cool off, recenter, find some grounding in yourself. I don't think that has to be punitive. I think we can do that kind of work in ways that are shared leadership, that are shared decision making, that make those decisions with kids. I don't want to do that for tardiness. I don't want to do that for, like, minor things. But if a student brings a weapon to school, like, and the state's requiring us to do a mandatory something, like, I think we have to do that. And like, we can do that in ways that are restorative. So that's kind of the situation in that video. To me, and I think we say this in the Starts and Stumbles article, that I think we have to see restorative justice in education as not a set of practices, but rather an ethos, a set of principles. We have to see it as a collection of initiatives, right? Like, so for example, in the little book of Restorative Justice in Education, we lay out 3 components of RJE: nurturing healthy relationships, repairing harm and transforming conflict, and establishing just and equitable learning environments. I don't really care what you call those 3 things, but we've got to do those 3 things. You can call it restorative justice in education. We can call it social emotional learning. We can call it justice education. I am not wedded to the term RJE. I am very much committed to just and equitable learning environments. And however we need to do things differently in order to do justice and create more equitable outcomes for all of our students and staff, like whatever that looks like, let's do that. We have to nurture healthy relationships, whether that's through circles or whether that's through just being kind to our kids, whether it's greeting them at the bus, whether it's playing games. I don't really care. Like, the specifics are going to be different from school to school to school, but we have to nurture healthy relationships, and we have to figure out how to do conflict well. Y'all, we stink at conflict. We don't know how to disagree with one another. We don't know how to fight nicely. There are times we need to fight. We do. We need conflict. We need to fight. We need to argue and wrestle, because that's the real stuff of relationships. My partner and I spent the first 2 years being all kind and nice to one another. And I remember the day we had our first fight, and I was scared to death she was going to walk out the door. But we worked through it. We figured it out. And our relationship became stronger. And every time we've had conflict, we've worked it out because we're committed. And that's the real stuff of relationships. And yet we are not willing to do that with our colleagues, and we are not willing to do that with our students. It's as if we are not invested in those relationships enough to stand through the conflict. And we have to figure out how to do that well. If you can't fight with a colleague and then still be good colleagues at the end of it, then our relationships aren't worth much. That's real. And so how do we do that conflict in good ways? And so those three components to me are everything. And I only say that to say, like, I don't need anybody to do a circle process in order to be a restorative justice school. I love a circle process. Don't get me wrong. I teach circles. I would sit in circles for hours and hours and hours. But restorative justice isn't about circle process. It's so much bigger. Circle process is but one practice that can help us build good, healthy relationships and work through conflict and do problem solving together and right? Does that make sense? Alita, I think you asked that question, so I want to ask and see if you've got a follow-up.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. And with you reiterating that RJ is about ethos, the principles, and how that looks in terms of practices is something totally different. So I appreciate you validating my understanding and reiterating what restorative justice is all about, because I think it's going to be critical as we move forward in APS in echoing what you said in terms of those core values and principles and how you create those environments, and then connecting it to some of the things that we're currently doing. So that I'm happy to hear that, because it scares me when we say, okay, we want this teacher to do a circle in their classrooms, when these other essential principles and values are not a part of it, then we're stuck in the same situation and having unsafe, unhealthy learning environments. So I appreciate that.
And you can actually do more harm than good when you require a teacher to do a circle that she doesn't want to do or he doesn't want to do. Because, yeah, I tell this story all the time. I was watching a circle process once, and a teacher had asked me to come watch them facilitate. And they had a couple of students that were being really disruptive of circle, and they wanted some advice about what to do with disruptive students during circle. And so I walked in, and so I sat with them and we did circle, and she didn't even point out the kid that she was having problems with. I could tell immediately, not because of what the child did, but because of what the teacher did, right? When the talking piece got to him, I watched her body language. Like, she put her hands, like, crossed her arms in front of her, and she got stiff, and I could see her not be warm and inviting to this child. And he spoke, but I could see him keep like looking at her, and then he passed the talking piece. And then when it came around again, he just passed, he didn't share. And then like after the third round, he was done. And like he started like talking to his neighbor, and then she got frustrated, and so she asked him to leave the circle. And afterwards she was like, did you see what I was talking about? He's so disruptive. And I mean, we had a long conversation about nonverbal cues, right? And like, so can I tell you what I noticed? And it was a difficult conversation, but we worked through it. And I said, you don't like that kid, and he knows that you don't like him. And so like, I think we can do harm if we haven't internalized that every child is worthy and relational. And I see dignity for every one of my kids. I see their worth. I see their value. So yeah.
Thank you.
Kathy, I have a quick question.
Okay.
Just about that, do you find like having a survey, I guess I'm trying to figure out, how do you get to a baseline so that you know what the strengths are and what to target and focus? Like, with your example, I mean, if we have a whole bunch of teachers like that, then obviously that will help us. It will dictate where we start. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how do you navigate figuring out what the baseline is so that you can go forward with the strengths, whatever they
Sure.
are? Like you said, meet people where they are. So I'm
Right.
just curious about that.
Well, and this is the disadvantage of me coming in as an outsider and naming those kinds of things, because I don't know the people. And so if I'm part of a team in a school and that team is made up of people from that school, then that team has the relationships with all of those educators in that building, and the principals and the school nurse and the bus drivers and the cafeteria workers. Like, the context matters so much. And so the team that is the RJ kind of leadership team in that school, whether that's 5 people or 7 people or 3 people, probably 5 is better than 3. But if you've got a team of people in that school that are doing that kind of work, then that team gets to know that teacher who's a resistor, right? And I don't want to ever dismiss, and I appreciate, Alex, what you said there. I don't want to ever dismiss the resistor. I'm going to learn more from that person who's a resistor to RJ than I'm going to learn from the person who popped right on and said, oh yeah, me, I'm all about this, right? Because the person who's a bit resistant, a little bit reluctant to get on board, like, their concerns are what I need to pay attention to, because I'm all on board. And so I can have blind spots because I'm like all in, ready to go. And that teacher that's a little bit reluctant, that teacher sees things that I might miss. And so through relationship, I want to have those kind of conversations. And I want to value and honor that teacher as much as I value and honor the teacher who's all in. Mostly because that's the restorative way, but also because I can learn a lot and see things that I might miss otherwise. Does that make sense, Marcia?
Yes, it does. And I actually like the idea of valuing the folks who are not all in, because I appreciate what you're saying. I think we have a tendency to go with the supporters and sort of dismiss the other folks and like, oh, whatever, and push them aside. But
Yeah.
I appreciate what you're saying in terms of just everyone is valued,
Yeah.
and yeah, thank you.
So the school in Michigan that I was talking about that had the Somali women who were having so many conflicts with their colleagues, their peers, and it was really toxic and destructive for them. That school, the principal did this really beautiful thing that I loved. She had I'm sure she didn't share this with anybody, but she had a piece of paper that she kept with her, and it had 4 quadrants. And in the top quadrant, she had supportive and vocal, so SV. And then over here, she had supportive and quiet, SQ. And then over here, she had resistant and quiet, RQ. And over here, she had resistant and vocal, RV. And she took all of the staff and put them in one of those, penciled them in one of those boxes, right? Based on kind of where they were in support of the new initiative of RJ. And her goal was just to move them up a box through relationships, right? If they had somebody who was really loud and reluctant, she'd just have conversations with them and say, hey, I hear your resistance. Let's have conversation. And oh, what a good point. Hey, could I invite you just to watch and maybe slow down your criticism? Just listen for a little bit. We'll still have the conversations and I'll listen to your criticism, but maybe not in faculty meeting, right? So it's just moving them up a box relationally, right? But you do that hard work like you do any other hard work relationally. So yeah, it was an interesting strategy that she used. And I always think about that when I think about how to impact people who are resistance. Okay, I know we're running short on time. I say just a little bit about special education. Special ed, like race, like gender, students with special needs who have IEPs are so overrepresented in our discipline systems. And so I'm really, really grateful that you're bringing up special ed. It's problematic for RJ because so many of the RJ practices rely on specific skills that sometimes our kids with special needs don't have. Circle process being one of those, right? So if I'm nonverbal, autistic, how do I show up well for a talking circle? That's why RJ can't be about our practices. It has to transcend our practices. Because if I'm a special ed teacher with all kids who struggle with communication challenges in one form or the other, circle process is probably not going to be my first go-to on practices. I'm going to have other things that we're going to do related to building healthy relationships and resolving and transforming conflict and establishing justice and equity in my classroom. And so I think we have to vary our practices based on who's in the room. So I think that's important. I mentioned this book a minute ago. Mark Thorsborn wrote another book that I don't have here. It's at the office. I'm so sorry. But it's Restorative Practices for Students with Special Needs. And in there, she talks about communication challenges, behavior challenges, and cognitive challenges. And they talk about how to adapt restorative justice practices in all three of those categories. It's a really good book. And so for her, she's in that book, they're talking about adapting RJ for students with special needs. I would like to humbly assert that not only could we adapt RJ to accommodate for students with special needs, but I would like to say that we could adjust special ed to be more restorative. And I don't mean just like special ed classrooms. I mean the whole practice of ableism and the way that that shows up in our language, the way that shows up in how we interact with one another. And if we could learn from our restorative justice and apply those principles to the way we, I don't know, do IEP meetings. Like, could an IEP meeting actually be in circle so that parents and caregivers actually get to speak into the process, not just in some perfunctory statement from the parents and caregivers, right? Which is the way our IEPs are often done. We have to have a parent represent, you know. Well, what if they don't have a parent? Let's not even use the language parent. Let's make sure we're using family or caregiver or grown-ups, right? So I think, yeah. So the other thing about special ed that I want to name is sometimes we just need to be quiet. So I was having this conversation with one of my special ed teachers, one of my friends who's a special ed teacher. And she taught students who often struggled with communication. And she said, hey, Kathy, can we do a quiet circle, like a silent circle? And so I was like, sure, I've never done one of those. Let's try it and see what happens. And so this was in a circle process class, so low risk, right? So it was 12 educators sitting in circle. And so we decided we would do a silent circle. And we decided to make it art-based. And so in the centerpiece, we had just a big piece of white butcher paper and markers and scissors and construction paper and glue and a talking piece. And we just did it silently. And I had the talking piece. I could do anything I wanted to do. And then I passed it. And then that person did what they wanted to do. And the coolest thing happened about the end of the second round. We started doing something together. And instead of me doing my little art squiggles over here and you doing your little art squiggles, our butcher paper and construction paper became this shared art project. And we ended up with a piece of art that we co-created together. And we did it all without words. And it was powerful and beautiful. And oh my goodness, I wish that kids could experience that kind of shared moment of, look what we created together. And it was so beautiful. And I was so grateful that she pushed that out and said, let's try this silent circle. And again, that brings me to this idea that, like, everything I know I've learned from educators, right? I have really beautiful ideas and I love restorative justice and education so much. But what does it look like for this kid or for that teacher or for this school, for this community? I'm at a loss there. I have to rely on the people in the room. And so as you're doing the work, that's my biggest piece of advice always, is work with people. And I heard you say it, collaboratively do the rollout. I don't know the school. In one school, they had a really huge music program. And so when they were having conversations as a staff about how do we do good relationship building, somebody said, well, everybody's musical here. Like, what if we put a piano in the cafeteria? Well, what a crazy idea that is. And it wouldn't work in so many schools, but it did in that school. They put a piano in the cafeteria, and when kids were finished eating, they would gather around the piano and sing. And it created community because that school was all about the music, right? And I know the critique there is, well, it could have created more conflict, but that principal knew her students and knew that that would be a relational thing for them. And so I think trusting the people who are on the ground, who are in the context, and saying, how do we do this work well? So, yeah. Other follow-up questions or thoughts or whatever? I'm sorry, I know we're way over time. Your agenda kind of like, sorry.
We're in perfect time, Kathy. Everything is ideal.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I actually had another question if we have a minute, otherwise. Okay.
Go for it.
Kathy, yeah, I'd be really curious to hear about how RJ was rolled out in your experience of that in Harrisonburg. And specifically, you mentioned, I think, 4 or 5 schools kind of self-selected to start. Were they all of the same age level, if you will? Were they middle schools, high schools? Was it the full range? And could you talk about how that played out across elementary, middle school, and secondary school?
Yeah, it was all random at first. And then the more we met with the district level administrators, it was like, oh, we need to be more strategic and make sure that there is there are enough people in this school that they can form an actual team. I'll just say it this way. Knowing what I know now, we would have probably picked 2 or 3 schools and said, let's focus here first. And I don't know. I mean, because it was new, it was an invitation. Is anybody interested in learning more about RJE? And so who signed up is who studied RJE, right? And so I don't know that we could do that differently. It is what it is, right? And we learned. And so now people are being much more intentional about saying, hey, there's only one person at this particular elementary school who knows RJ, and they're trying to do it by themselves. And that's not sustainable. So now we're targeting like this particular school. Can we get volunteers from this school who want to study RJ and be part of that team? And so I think that's where we were pre-COVID. And then things are a little bit more up in the air. We do have a cohort starting this fall, and it will be completely online. And now we have 10 people from Harrisonburg City Schools, and we have 6 people from other parts of the country. And so it's not just Harrisonburg City Schools, and that's going to create a whole new dynamic. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But no, I don't think I would start with like, we're just going to start with elementary folks and then move up. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I would talk to people who are in the context and see what they think. I'm not sure what's the best.
Okay. One other quick follow-up, if that's all right, kind of along those lines.
Sure.
In terms of, would you see any possible merit in, it'll depend on the circumstance, but looking at the catchment area for, if you're looking at changing culture and something that will migrate and evolve as the children move through the system, trying to align in terms of high school, middle school, down to elementary, so
Maybe.
that, yeah, okay.
I mean, that I can see merit in that for sure. If we started at elementary level and then as it moves up, the kids it's what happened at Hamtramck, at the Michigan high school, right? That middle school kids went to high school and said, hey, we want circles.
Right.
And so that's what you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Kathy, will we have you after break, or are you going to leave us and enjoy the rest of your evening without us?
As I probably need to get on, I'm facilitating a workshop in the morning on anti-racism for EMU. So it's a big deal. I'm not facilitating by myself, but there are some last minute details I'd like to do. So maybe, are y'all done by 8:30 or 9?
We go till 9.
You go to 9?
We try not to keep anyone too much past 9, but we almost always go at least right up to 9.
Can I want to stay, but mostly I want to hear from you. I don't want to talk anymore, but I would like to listen and hear what y'all are thinking.
Well, I think I can speak for the group that and say that we'd love to have you for as long as we can have you. We have a break scheduled now for 10 minutes for everyone to take care of any needs and have a deep breath. But if you will rejoin us in the break, after the break, I actually had one quick question as a follow-up to Alex's question, but I don't want to delay everyone's break much longer, if that's all right.
How long's the break?
10 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. I'll shoot off some emails real quick, and
Fantastic.
then I will join you.
All right, friends.
Great.
If everyone can rejoin us at 8:12. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, hang on a second.
Who are English language learners and their families. And so I think those are all really exciting things. As far as whether or not one school would become a restorative school and that by demand that would kind of rise up, I mean, theoretically, that makes a lot of sense because then it's based on needs. It's based on what people are inviting rather than being imposed. And so I think that makes sense to me. And again, I would defer to leadership in the schools. I would defer to people who are in the context to say, yeah, I think this will work for us, or no, I don't think this will work for us. I haven't been a part of a system where they picked one school and said, we're gonna go with one school. That doesn't mean that it's not a good idea. It just means I haven't seen that. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. So if you think it works, I mean, it's worth checking into. What an interesting concept, though, that you can do countywide choice. That's interesting. Are people, question, like, are they responsible for their own transportation to those schools? So if they opt for the Montessori school, do they have to provide their own transportation to that school, or does the district do that?
I think the district takes care of it, although we might have an APS person in the group who would know better than I do, but I think the district it's taken care of in the same way, but I don't have a really solid answer. I'm sorry.
That's okay. The other question that I would have about that is, and the reason I ask about transportation, because we think about barriers. So does everybody have equitable access to choosing the school that they want to go to? Or would there be barriers like transportation or what time the school starts and ends? Would there be those kind of barriers that would preclude some students from being able to access that opportunity to choose a school? And in choosing a school, does it disenfranchise students who aren't able to get access to that? Does that make sense? So that's
a useful question. Thank you. I think Arlington is also geographically relatively compact. So that might not be as much of an issue, but I think it's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, and so other barriers, for example, like, do they have to get approval to do that, or is it just a request? So for example, one local district, not Harrisonburg, but another district nearby, has a governor's school, but you have to jump through 2 major hoops in order to get into the governor's school. And sometimes students of color in particular have trouble getting the reference that, because a teacher makes assumptions about capability. And so therefore a particular teacher isn't willing to write that recommendation. And then their bias precludes students of color from being able to access the governor's school. And so sometimes those kind of barriers exist. And I think if we're going to really take a justice and equity lens, we have to kind of foresee those. And so those are some questions that I have about optional things. And it may be all, fine, but it would be something I'd want to check in on. I appreciate that question.
Thank you.
Can I say one more thing about representation? I heard when the question was asked about special ed and English language learners, I think I heard somebody say that like 10 to 12% of the population of students is special ed. That would also be something I'd want to follow up on. I don't think that's commensurate with national averages. And so is there a higher percentage of students who are qualifying for special ed? And if so, what are the factors? So that, again, a justice thing, an equity thing, like why are kids being placed in special ed? Is it is a high number of behavior challenges. And so we're opting for an EBD label or an ED label when what we're really looking at is perhaps trauma or something that might be impacting that. So those are questions that I would ask about that number as well.
I mean, it could, like, my family moved here specifically for the special education offerings. The special education programs here are probably the best in the
Really?
DC metro area.
Okay, good.
So, I mean, that might be part of it.
That could be part of it, yeah.
But I
So,
think in line with Kathy, there is some disproportionality as it relates to minority students in APS. And we've been pretty transparent about that and trying to address some of those issues of disproportionality among Black and Latino students in special education. So that is something that we are confronted with in APS as well. So
yeah. And those are, again, sometimes we have to fight, but we got to know how to fight well, right? I've got to be able to name those things and manage dignity and relationships and work with people in good, healthy ways, even when there's conflict like that. So I appreciate you naming those things. And again, that's why, like, I don't get to come in and say stuff because I don't know that context. I don't know that people are specifically moving to APS because of a good special ed program. So those numbers can look suspicious to me from an outside perspective, and working with local folks who are on the ground and who know that's really important. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Kathy. Leanne, did you want to offer your question?
Sure, yes. And I'm actually added to my question, but it sounded, Kathy, like the starting point, at least for the schools in Harrisonburg, was is having cohorts from the school go through the certification program. And I wonder if that's how you recommend starting with, you know, some kind of training like that, and how long is that program? And then wrapped in that, I also wonder how students access training for student-led parts, or do they in Harrisonburg, or the places that they have? I know you told us how Anita Vatva started hers. If you know of other ways that students have access to training.
Yeah. So from my experience, it's been the educators or the adults in the building who've gotten trained first, and then they have done trainings with the students. I know in Harrisonburg, they are starting to do that now. And beautifully, it's the English language program that the person who directs the newcomer program is a graduate of the RJE program at EMU, and is really excited. And so she's like, all of our ELL teachers are gonna, you know, like, we're gonna make sure that they're equipped and ready to go. And so they've been doing a lot of student leadership. And that's been beautiful to see. Yeah, so for yeah, I mean, I'm a teacher educator. It's the role that I play. And when I first learned about restorative justice, I was like, that's going to be my wheelhouse, and, you know, stay in your lane, dude, kind of thing. Because I can't do RJ in so many contexts, and I had to pick something, and I was trained as a teacher educator. It's where my heart is. My heart is for teachers. I love teachers, one in particular a lot, but I love educators, right? And I think they're amazing powerhouses, and they're creative, and they're compassionate, and they're brilliant in how they problem solve, like minute to minute with this child and this child and this child. And man, I love educators. And so I work with teachers. That's what I do. I love to work with teachers. I love to learn from teachers. I love to sit and collaborate with teachers. And so for me, my work is as a teacher educator. And so how do I do RJ? I teach teachers. That's my thing. Other people are camping out in equipping students, and that's their thing. And so I want to make sure I don't speak outside of my area. And so that's why I would refer you to Anita's work if we're talking about how to equip students. As far as how to start working with educators, we started a graduate program because it made sense to me to, rather than waiting until somebody goes through and becomes a teacher and then later on, like, oh, let me go learn about RJ. Let's build it into their preparation program. So when I came to EMU, it just made sense to move that direction. And so I'm grateful to work at a place where they were already familiar with RJ. And so we were able to put together courses from the Ed Department and from the Center for Justice and Peace Building to create a graduate program. But I want to be really, really clear, like that ain't the only way to do it. And I love our graduate certificate and the 5 classes that the Harrisonburg City Schools folks have been taking as a cohort. Man, they're sequential. They start out like the foundations of RJE, and we read the little book of RJE and 100 other texts, and we dig into the philosophy of restorative justice and why it works and how it works and what are those principles, and we lay foundations. And then there's a peace building and conflict transformation course where we take just that one component on conflict and harm, and we go deep with conflict. And Judy Mullet teaches that class, and it's a beautiful class. And then there's a circle process class where we really dig into how to facilitate a circle process. And then there's a whole course on just restorative discipline practices and looking at those responsive interactions. And then there's an elective class, and there's a slew of classes that you can take as an elective. One being about how RJ intersects with trauma, and another about leadership, and another. So I love our program, I do, but it is not the only way that people can become deeply equipped. People become deeply equipped by sitting and learning from people who are doing it, right? Who already understand it deeply. And, you know, I swore from the beginning that it would never be about me or EMU, but it's about educators and learning. And so I think however we do that kind of mentorship program, so that, again, coming back to Vygotsky, we have more knowledgeable others who are teaching other people what they know, and mentoring that and learning together collaboratively. I do think that when you get into more tier 3 type conferencing, we can really cause harm if we don't know what we're doing. You take 2 kids who've been in a fight and you try to just throw them in circle together and talk it out. If you don't know how to facilitate a circle, and you don't really, if you haven't internalized those processes, and I think we can really mess up there. And so I would only, admonish people to make sure that if you're going to try to facilitate tier 3 type conflict circles, that you sit with people who've done that and you co-facilitate for a little bit so that you get a good sense of what it means to do a good pre-conference. And yeah, I don't skip the pre-conference. This is so crucial, right? But yes, last year I got invited to facilitate a conference for pretty serious harm, and I referred it out because that's not my wheelhouse. I don't have the experience to do those kinds of harm circles in ways that some of my colleagues do. And so I actually referred that one out because I don't want to cause harm. So does that help, Leanne?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Does anyone else have any additional questions for Kathy? I think she mentioned that she would need to run.
I'm really grateful for APS, y'all. I'm super grateful for the work y'all are doing. I'm super grateful for the way you're doing it. And I'm kind of humbled to have this opportunity. Super grateful for y'all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Kathy.
I'll have a good
Thank you.
discussion about next steps.
Yes.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
All right, friends, should we stop the recording now?
Oh, yes. Let me do that.
Okay.